Hello, and welcome to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. I'm the Ryan half of Ryan and Brian, and this is episode number 30. This week, Brian and I are talking about the Apocrypha. As you might recall, earlier this year, we talked about the intertestamental period, which is the time between the Old and New Testament. We talked about some of the conflicts and rulers of the time, but we didn't talk too much about the stories and texts that were told and written then, which came to be known as the Apocrypha. In this episode, we look at some of the stories and the relevance they can have as we are reading scripture. And if you're confused by the title of this episode about sparrows being the worst, don't worry, it will all become clear as you listen. Before we get started, if you're enjoying the podcast, would you mind leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or a review on Facebook? And if that's not your thing, would you mind just sharing the post about this episode or another episode you've enjoyed on Facebook? Or just tell your friends. That works too. We'd love to expand our audience and continue to grow. All right, let's jump into this episode looking at the Apocrypha. All right, Brian, welcome back to the Bistro.
Hey, Ryan, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a long time since we've been back in the Bistro.
Yeah, I mean, minutes, hours, days. Hey,
it's all the illusion.
It's all illusion.
We've had a wardrobe change.
And I will say, you've got a stunning shirt on.
Well, this was plaid day.
Plaid day. You know, you've made fun of my wardrobe in that I usually... No, you didn't... No, it was more of an observation.
An observation.
You
wear the same thing a lot.
Right, which I note I am wearing a different...
Yeah.
I'm wearing a button-up shirt today.
Good.
But I made a note that you are a fan of plaid.
I do wear plaid a lot. I don't know. I like it. And so this shirt, I got it Meyer.
Hair. We say it French here, so it's fancy.
It was on the clearance rack, and so...
Oh, man, it's good. It's that blue plaid. It's really making your eyes pop.
It makes my brown eyes blue.
Is that something? I don't know.
Anyway.
This is why you all came to the Bistro.
Right. Well, let's talk about something different then.
All right. So, hey, last week we talked about different versions of the Bible. And
was that last week?
Yeah.
Okay.
Last week.
Whenever I make a time reference, you always change the order of the...
Oh, I make the change to the order? Anyway,
okay.
In a time previous to now, when will then
in the future?
when will then be now? Spaceballs reference. So we talked about some manuscripts, and there were different versions of the manuscripts. And one of the things we talked about was John 7:53 through 8:11, and it was the woman caught in the act of adultery.
Sure.
And so I asked you some questions about that, like, where did this come from? And you said, like, actually, I think this comes from the Apocrypha.
Well, I didn't say it comes from the Apocrypha,
not comes from
but
Apocrypha.
It has relation to a story in the Apocrypha, I think, and that there's part of that that's going on. Yeah, no, I don't think it comes from the Apocrypha. Be very careful there.
Okay, yes. My deepest apologies. That there was some relation to a story in the Apocrypha. And so we started talking, and we've done an episode on the intertestamental period and some of the things that were happening there, and that the Apocrypha helps us understand what's happening in there. And so I just started asking you some questions about, like, let's talk about some extra biblical literature and what that is, where it comes from. And so, tell us.
Extra biblical, and particularly, I'd say what we're going to focus on today is in intertestamental literature. So we've talked about the intertestamental period, and I've mentioned, I think, before that there are these books that were written after the time of the Old Testament, before the New Testament, that we don't consider to be inspired by God in the same way that the New Testament or the Old Testament is. We don't understand it to be authoritative in the same way, and yet there are these books. There's two different groups of books I'm going to talk about, but the Apocrypha you mentioned specifically. The Apocrypha is read by Christians for a long period of time, and continues to be read depending upon what particular church you might be a part of. There are those who give it some different importance than others. For example, in the Roman Catholic Church, most Roman Catholic Bibles, this is where most people become familiar with the Apocrypha, will contain that. But there's Protestant translations, like the King James Version, for example, has the Apocrypha in it. You can get the Apocrypha in the King James Version. It was originally translated. Some of the early manuscripts of Christian Bibles in Greek contain the Apocrypha. And so it was read by Christians for a long time. Again, not necessarily thinking that it was inspired or that it's equal to, let's say, the Gospels or the Book of Malachi or anything like that, but can tell us something about this intertestamental period that I've talked about some. So we'll talk about that. The other group of books is interesting too. It's called the pseudepigrapha. So the Apocrypha is a very specific group of books, and it depends on how you count, because some of these books are parts of other books, but we usually say around 14 books that were written in Greek. These don't occur in Hebrew, but they're written in Greek after the period of the time that the Old Testament, I would say, canon was closed, but after the period of the writing of the Old Testament, before the first century, before the coming of Jesus, first century AD, we find this group of 14 books that then kind of get circulated together. I mentioned some of them, two of them. In fact, we'll talk about Susanna here a little bit, but Susanna and Bel and the Dragon are additions to the book of Daniel, for example. There's
Bel the dragon.
Bel and the Dragon.
Bel and the Dragon.
Bel and the Dragon. Related to Baal. It's a name for a foreign deity. But there's different kinds of literature. There's one book that is called Sirach that is like Proverbs. It's a series of wise sayings. But the pseudepigrapha, then, what that means is it's falsely attributed. In other words, these are books that were falsely attributed to different authors.
Okay.
The most famous probably is the book of First Enoch, and I'll mention that a little bit later. But some different books in that group, and that's a kind of a bigger group and a little bit more of an ambiguous group than the Apocrypha, that also from this rough period of time between the closing of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. But these 14 books that occurred, they appeared in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which we call the Septuagint. Mm-hmm. They appeared in the Latin Vulgate, which is why then in the Roman Catholic, I mentioned before, the Roman Catholic Church used the Latin Vulgate quite highly, and so we find that they were translated then into most modern Roman Catholic translations. And so there are these two different groups of books that are sometimes interesting. Let me go ahead and mention pseudepigrapha. I mentioned First Enoch. Do you have your Bible there? I think you got rid of your Bible.
I
I
never get rid of my Bible.
Look at the book of Jude, verse 14. I want you to read that for me, this is interesting to a lot of people that they find this.
Jude 14.
Yeah, just verse 14.
It was about these that Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, "Look, the Lord comes with tens of thousands of his holy ones."
Okay, and do you have a footnote there that says something about where that comes from?
Yes. Wait. I don't, actually.
You don't? Really?
Wait. Hold on. I don't think I do.
This shows that we rehearsed this, so...
Yes. No, it doesn't.
Well, here's what my footnote says. I had you just read 14. If you read 15, send thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone, to convict all of them of the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness, and all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Then you'll have a footnote.
Well, it says he pictured this judgment by quoting a prophecy from 1 Enoch 1:9.
Okay, so here's the interesting thing is, so 1 Enoch is one of these pseudepigraphical books that occurs before the time of the writing of the New Testament. And Jude makes a reference to it here. Now, I don't think that means that Jude necessarily considered it inspired, but he's using this tradition that everybody would have been familiar with. And this is the thing I think, the reason the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha can be useful to us in understanding the message of the Scriptures is it shows us something about, we've talked about worldview before, it shows us something about the worldview of people in the first century. So if Jude knew this book and he knew it, he thought his readers would know it well enough to be able to just refer to it, that shows us that it had some impact upon their
They would have known it. He wasn't going to just reference something they would have no frame of reference
and
for.
So he uses that reference there. Again, I don't think that necessarily means he thinks it's inspired, but he makes that reference in order to make his point about false teachers there in that place. So books like the pseudepigrapha and the Apocrypha, I think they can help us get into the mindset or the worldview of the people that Jesus was speaking to, that Paul was writing to, that Jude and Peter and the other authors, John. I think it helps us understand. I'll give you a couple of examples of that, I think, in the Apocrypha. Now, you mentioned the story of the adulterous woman. Well, yeah, I think let's start there. The story of the adulterous woman. All I mentioned is there's this other story that is very similar, and in fact, there's some language in that story in that we as we find it in the Gospel of John. When we talked about textual criticism, it probably is not original to the Gospel of John. But what I didn't say then is there's a early Christian author that makes a reference to this story about Jesus forgiving an adulterous woman, and this could be an authentic story of Jesus that made its way in because, and it's a well-loved story today because of its message and because it was considered to be important. Didn't know exactly where to put it sometimes. Sometimes it's in the Gospel of Luke, a couple of different places it occurs in manuscripts in the Gospel of John, but it finally kind of lights here and people pay attention to it. But this story has some similar language to a story in the Apocrypha. And again, remember the Apocrypha was not written in Hebrew, it was written in Greek. But one of the things is, do you remember in the story of the adulterous woman? This is the first thing that made me notice this connection, actually. In the story of the adulterous woman, it says they came, and here's the interesting thing, it says they came to trap Jesus. That's how it begins. And so they basically say what should be done with this woman who is caught in adultery, and Jesus doesn't say anything. Instead, it says he begins to write, and it says, and we don't know what he wrote, and there's lots of speculation about that, but it says that they went away from him from the oldest, from the elders first. Now, in the book of Susanna, is a part of it was an addition, I would say, to the book of Daniel. Again, it doesn't occur in Aramaic or Hebrew. It's only in Greek. This story of Susanna, there are these two elders of Israel that make a false accusation against Susanna. And so it's a similar kind of story. Go ahead. You have Susanna there?
I do.
Just read the first couple of verses there for us, kind of set the scene, talks about her father. There, go ahead and read just a little bit of that.
Yeah, there was a man living in Babylon whose name was Joachim. He married the daughter of Hilkiah, named Susanna, a very beautiful woman and one who feared the Lord. Her parents were righteous and had trained their daughter according to the law of Moses. Joachim was very rich and had a fine garden adjoining his house. The Jews used to come to him because he was the most honored of them all.
Okay, so one of the things that's interesting in the Apocrypha are several of these books that have narratives to them. They're stories. They start talking about the righteousness of the people. And you got to remember, this is kind of a time where there's Israel's been in captivity. The things are not going the way that they're supposed to. And so what we find here in this story is Joachim here and Hilkiah they're seen as righteous people. So this is a righteous family. And even in the midst of wickedness, and that's one of the things that we're going to see is there's a story of kind of righteousness versus wickedness in the book of Susanna. So it says that he had this great garden. And I'm going to go ahead and just tell you the story. You can read it. It's actually pretty good. Some people call it the earliest detective novel. It's a pretty cool story. But what happens is that they used to gather in his garden because it was a good gathering place for the Jews in this exile community, in this community of exiles, and particularly what happened there are these two elders of Israel. Now, here's the whole point. An elder of Israel was supposed to have, if you read the Old Testament, an elder was supposed to have a high standing within the community because they were supposed to be leaders. And they were supposed to be spiritual leaders of the people. They were the ones who were supposed to be righteous themselves. And, they were seen as having wisdom because they'd lived a long time and these kind of things. And so these two elders, though, independently begin to lust after Joachim's wife, whose name's Susanna, as you saw there. And they both start getting in the habit of kind of hiding, trying to watch her in the garden so they can kind of...
Because she bathes in the garden.
Well, yeah. And so they find each other there eventually. They see each other there and basically, say, what are you doing here? Well, what are you doing here? And they find out that the same thing. And so they make this... They same way that there are these people who try to trap Jesus, they kind of make a trap for Susanna, because the whole thing is, and here's the point, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says the testimony of two elders is irrevocable. In the court system, the way it worked within the law is if two elders, because again, they were seen as upright people, righteous people, if they testified about anything, that was considered to be airtight. Two or three, in the presence of two or three witnesses, this should be done. So what happens is they hatch this plot that they're going to catch Susanna and they're going to try to force her to sleep with them. And the way they're going to do this is to say that they'll make a false accusation against her if she doesn't. So what happens is they wait until, like you said, she's bathing. They go and catch her. They tell her their plot, and she refuses. She refuses them. And basically we get in the narrative that she has this idea that it's better for me to die than to, this is how righteous she is, than to do what would be against the law of God.
Yeah. And the charge they place against her is that there was another man in there with her,
another man,
and that he escaped.
Yes. And so what happens is she ends up yelling, people come running, and these two elders of Israel say that she was with another man. Now, she was meeting a man in the garden, and that he gets away. So here's another interesting parallel with Jesus and the adulterous woman. This has often been noted. I've heard this in sermons noted before, that in the story that we have in John, that passage that's there.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. The story. Let's just call it the story of the adulterous woman, or pericope adulterae. But the story.
Whatever. Yep, that's the one.
The story of the adulterous woman we have. You might remember she's brought alone.
Right. It says she was caught, but there is no man.
There's no man present. And according to law, both of them, if it was an act of adultery, should have been brought on trial. So what happens then is, these people can't believe that Susanna, this would happen. And so they have these kind of formal, this formal trial for her.
But the two elders have.
Yeah, well, just wait.
Yeah,
so God speaks to Daniel, though. And so the hero Daniel comes on the scene, and basically, the two elders testify against her. And so, the penalty for adultery is stoning. And so that's what's going to happen. She's going to die. So what happens is Daniel comes on the scene, and he independently questions both of the elders. And here's the question. He says, well, if you saw Susanna with her lover, under what tree was she, meeting him? And both of them give different answers. So it shows that they're giving false testimony, which is very interesting, because according to the law, same Deuteronomy passage, it says that if you give false testimony, then the witness should receive the penalty that the person they were testifying against should receive. So really what should happen in the case here is that both of them should die. And that's what Daniel basically says, because you've lied. And he makes a joke in Greek, which is kind of hard to translate, but basically says, well, you saw him under this tree, the same thing that, the way it's sometimes translated. One translation I saw said, you saw them under the yew tree, well, you'll be hewn in half. There's kind of this play on words. And this other one, you saw them under the clove tree, well, you'll be cleaved in half, And so you're going to receive this penalty. And so that's what happens. Susanna is exonerated. These two elders then are put to death because they're giving false testimony. And the whole point of this story is kind of, again, this contrast of righteousness versus the wickedness. And it's kind of an expectation. Here's this righteous woman, and yet there are these two elders that should have been righteous, and yet they're doing this in order to try to entrap her, to use her for their own purposes. So there's some similarities. Do you see there's a similar kind of trap? Now, here's the part that people sometimes get a little upset when I start talking about this, because they bring not Susanna, they bring the woman in the case of the story of the adulterous woman, but not the man. But I always ask then my students, what's the trap here? So, and you can answer this a couple of different ways, but what's the trap for Jesus? Like, what are his choices when they say what should be done with this woman? Well, the law says stone her to death, right?
Right.
And so I always say this, a trap always needs two sides. It's like a bear. If you imagine a bear trap, it needs two sides in order for the trap to be sprung. So on the one hand, it's the idea, well, there's this. And what students will a lot of times say, well, Jesus was a graceful person and he didn't want to see her punished. But that was the law. What I wonder is if they're not trying to trap him and they're giving false witness as well, just like the elders in the story there. Because here's what Deuteronomy says. It says that the elders, the ones who are making the accusation, the witnesses against the person, are to be the first people to throw the stones. So here are these ones who are ready to stone her, and Jesus then refuses to answer. So what I wonder is if she wasn't really taken in adultery. Now it says that she was taken in adultery, but there's some way in which they're being false with this accusation, is what I think.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think that they may have set her up or, whatever.
Right.
However we understand this, what happens is, I think, is perhaps they're looking for Jesus to make, a statement against her that is going to show that he's not really a prophet. And so when he begins to write in the dirt, I think he's probably writing the book of Deuteronomy. He's writing this passage about false witnesses, and the ones who are making the accusation are the ones who are then to throw the first stone. And you might remember that's what he says. He talks about this idea of casting the stone, the one who's without sin. And I think the idea is without sin in this matter should cast the first stone. Now, whether or not you think you interpret that the same way I do, the story of Susanna kind of shows us that there's this kind of thing going on, that this is not an unheard of kind of practice. And again, it gives us some insider understanding there. Questions on that or comments? Anything you want to say?
No, I think it's the connection is really interesting,
right,
to see those two pieces.
Yeah.
And that, I think, again, kind of going back to the Enoch thing, is that this would have been some literature that would have been known to the people. People
would have been familiar with this story. I think that's correct. I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So why, I don't know, maybe I'm jumping the shark here, but why isn't this included? I mean, we understand
Sure.
that it's not, I think one of the things you said is what you appreciated about the canon was there were some books that were not included in that. That's how it makes you have confidence. And then what we have is what God wanted. But, there are some traditions that include that in there. But what was this split like? Why we don't have it, if it does illuminate in some ways the rest of Scripture? I'm
going to tell you the funny thing is Christians, I'll say it this way, Christians read these stories for a long time. It's really the Protestant Reformation, even after, I mentioned the King James Version translated it, which was a Protestant translation. But Christians, even after the Reformation, continue to read these. They continue to know these. I'm going to talk about 1st and 2nd Maccabees in just a minute as well. A lot of that history we get from these books. We can read Josephus as well. People read, Protestants read Josephus as well. The point is, and you mentioned some traditions included in, I would say most traditions that use the Apocrypha do not consider it on par with the rest of Scripture. There's a term deuterocanonical, which means
extra canon.
Yeah, secondary importance, we might say something to that effect. And that's often the way that it's used. But even then, like I said, for a long period of time, people have read it. I think it became kind of this idea, these are in these Roman Catholic Bibles, so this must be some kind of, inappropriate book. And that's not the case at all. The word, and I didn't mention this already, the word Apocrypha means the hidden ones or the hidden things. And so, they sometimes will talk about this idea, I'd say it has to do with of hidden origins, but it'll have to do with this idea that, these are things we shouldn't read. And I don't think that's the case at all. We don't read them on par with Scripture, but they do illuminate the thought process. And I'll give you another good example, I think, later in the podcast, where I think it helps us understand some things about Jesus' statements and the way his disciples thought. A lot of it is that when Jesus is talking, as I've said when we talked about worldview, when Jesus is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, for example, to get ourselves as much as we can into the worldview of the people that are hearing that helps us to better understand what Jesus is saying. And that's really what I'm, don't read them. If you have a choice between reading the Bible and reading the Apocrypha, read the Bible. But if you want some extra understanding of the time and what people were thinking, I think the Apocrypha can help illuminate that. And I'll give you another, like I said, a couple of examples of that later on. But really, it was kind of almost a response to the separation between Roman Catholicism and the Protestant Church is why we began to kind of leave, quote unquote, leave it out.
Yeah. So in contrast to the pseudepigrapha. So do we know who wrote most of the books in the Apocrypha then? We have, because if the other one's falsely attributed,
well, there's this guy named Jesus that wrote Jesus ben Sirach. It's not that guy, but a different guy named Jesus. But we don't really know too much about who he is. But yeah, there are some that there will be some indication. There are some even in the Apocrypha, and this is where it gets a little tricky, that the Wisdom of Solomon, for example, and some of these books. But Sirach, we usually call it Sirach or Ben Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus is the Latin term that's used for it. Is written by some guy named Jesus. Not that guy, but another one. And
not that guy.
Well, but
not the big one.
Right. But we don't necessarily know, exactly everything about him. I mean, we can tell something again about the setting. Like I said, this seems to be a setting in exile. And there's a lot of these narratives that kind of have that story. What is it like to be a righteous, and again, the characters are usually these righteous people in this period of time where you're being oppressed and where you're in the midst of an exile community. How can you continue to be a righteous person in that context is kind of the if I had to summarize, that'd be
what the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha are about.
Apocrypha more than the Pseudepigrapha. And the Pseudepigrapha is just, like I said, it's kind of an amorphous group. There's all kinds of things in it. And I will say this, just so our listeners can understand this, there are books that are called New Testament Apocrypha or New Testament Pseudepigrapha. We're not talking about any of those at this point. We might talk about those later on. For me, those are not as interesting because they're after the period of the writing of the New Testament. But we're talking about these intertestamental books, which is the Old Testament Apocrypha and the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. Those are the ones that are really, to me, interesting because, again, they kind of tell us about the worldview of the people in the first century or a little bit earlier.
So you can, and if you understand that, then you can understand the world that Jesus is appearing in.
And that's why I'm interested in them. Yeah. Let's talk about First and Second Maccabees. We've talked about the history of this some. We talked about Daniel not too long ago on this podcast in an episode, and I mentioned these different kingdoms that arose and fell, and I mentioned specifically this period of time after Alexander. After Alexander the Great, there was this period that was called the Diadochoi, when his different generals took over different parts of the kingdom, and then eventually there's this kind of battle between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies down in Egypt, and they're kind of battling back and forth. The Syrians to the north of Israel and the Ptolemies to the south in Egypt, battling over this place we call Israel, Palestine. I should talk. That'd be something to talk about sometimes, the geography there and why that's such an important place. But that period of time is talked about in this book of First and Second Maccabees, and we've talked about the Syrians. Antiochus IV Epiphanes tried to wipe out Judaism, and the Maccabees. Then that's what these books are about. It's a history of that rebellion, that revolution, where they fought back against this oppressing Syrian army. And it tells us the origins of that. It tells us about their victories and eventually their ability to get into the temple and shut themselves in. It talks about all of the things that happened in that period of time. Here's the thing I think is helpful with that. Not only does it tell us kind of about that period of time that helps us understand the book of Daniel, there's a way that the Old Testament book of Daniel, we can kind of see what I understand, the prophecies in Daniel, some of them coming to pass in the book of First and Second Maccabees. But this is a common thing. Everybody understands this, and you hear this all the time. Jesus was not the kind of Messiah, right? He was not the kind of ruler king that people were expecting. And what will we often say? They were expecting what?
The warrior.
A military leader, a warrior. And we say that, and everybody understands that. I'd say when you begin to read Judas, about Judas Maccabeus, about his brothers, about the Maccabean Revolution, you begin to understand why they were expecting that kind of a Messiah. It's because God had, the Syrian army was a more powerful force, but God, their understanding, again, in these books, is that he raised up this family, this righteous family. Again, here it is, righteousness in the midst of this oppressing people. He raised them up, and what he did with them is that he threw off this oppressing power. Not only were they able to cleanse the temple,
Right.
Sound familiar to you?
Yes.
They were able to cleanse the temple and resume worship, even though Antiochus Epiphanes had desecrated the temple. But they were eventually able to have rule themselves, and they became kings of Judea, kings of the Jews.
Right.
And they reigned for a period of time. Now, here's the sad part of the story is you don't have to look too far down the road until just a couple of generations later. They're oppressing the people.
Right. It turns sour.
It does. And, it's the whole thing, what they say, absolute power, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, And so it's that kind of an image that we get or picture. But when people were looking for a Messiah, for example, John chapter 6, he feeds the 5,000. I think they're going, we are undefeatable with this guy as the general, right? Mm-hmm. And they try to make him king by force, is what John 6 says to us. And that's what they're kind of thinking. I've said this, I think I've said this before. It's interesting, the number of people, and Richard Bauckham did a really interesting study on this. Something like 90% of the young boys who were born in Judea in the first century were named after one of the Maccabean kings, one of the Maccabean rulers. And you just look at Jesus's disciples. There were two Judases, like Judas Maccabeus. Simon. There were two Simons. One was a zealot, and the other's the dude that he ended up naming Peter. So that's 4 out of the 12 right there. You have Matthew, which is a form of Mattathias. You have John. You have James. Yaakov. You have all of these different that are named. Most of them are named after one of those
warrior, conqueror.
And
Redeemer.
And why do you name your little boy, if you're a first century Jewish person living under the Roman Empire?
You're hoping your kid's the
one.
Why
do you name your kid Judas, right? You're thinking, this is, and that's what they're looking for, I think. So here's Simon, right? And when Jesus is when he's arrested, they told him earlier that night, I don't know if you've noticed this detail or not, but in Luke it says, he says, anyone who has a sword should sell it, now, and I've told you that before, now you should have a sword, basically saying there's kind of conflict coming. They said, well, there's two, and we find out later in the night, according to John's the only one who tells us this, that when Jesus is arrested, Peter is the one who draws out a sword. He's at least one of the ones that has a sword. I think the other Simon, we don't know this. This is my speculation. I think the other Simon, he's called the Zealot. It's probably the one who has the other sword.
He was ready for the fight.
He's ready for the battle. And that's what they see as happening. And even James and John, you might remember, either their mother or they themselves come and say, when you enter into your glory, can we set one on your right and one on your left? And they're not thinking in your kingdom. They're not thinking, we have this perspective of thinking about a heavenly kingdom. They are thinking about marching into Jerusalem, just like Judas Maccabeus did. And even though the Syrian forces were more powerful, they were able to take the temple and they were able to set up a kingdom. Mm-hmm. And they're thinking the same thing. Even though Rome's more powerful, well, we serve the God of Israel, and he's promised us he's sending a Messiah who's gonna give us this freedom, right?
Yeah.
And so when Jesus begins to say things like, it's Peter again, right? Jesus tells his disciples for the first time after Peter says, you're the Christ. We believe you're the Messiah. That's that word Christ means. Mm-hmm. We believe that you're this one sent from God, this special ruler, this special king sent from God, anointed one. Right after that, Jesus says, and now the Son of Man has to suffer and he has to die. And he's saying it's in accordance with the prophecies, right? Old Testament prophecy says this. And Peter says, never, Lord, right?
Right.
That can't happen.
Right.
And so, he's just recognized that Jesus is this Messiah. And now Jesus says he's going to die. And he's like, that's not the way the story goes. That's not the way it happened in First Maccabees, right?
Right.
And so I think that's where, those kind of things kind of help us understand, again, the mindset, the worldview of Jesus' disciples and kind of what's going on. When the crowds are trying to make him into king, I think this is what's on their mind. So that's why I think it's valuable to read it. Gives us the history from the perspective of Daniel, kind of gives us the mindset of the people who are looking for this Messiah. It tells us about, the things that happened in between. So
yeah, interesting. So I mean, what would you? I mean, would you say that you think it's beneficial for us as Christians to?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. When I would teach intro to read these, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but
I know, Brian, I'm just here. I'm just here.
No, come on.
No. I mean, do you think it's beneficial for Christians to, because I think again we talked about different versions, CSB,
Right.
ESV, and all that stuff. None of them include this material.
Well, yeah, a lot of them don't. The Revised Standard Version does. The New Revised Standard Version, you can find it. It's not too hard
I'm not
to find
saying
out there.
you can't find it. I'm just saying, like, I imagine most of our listeners are
Right.
using NIV, ESV, CSB.
I think that it is very valuable for us to read this. Again, it's more valuable to read Scripture.
You're right.
Don't hear me say anything different than that. And I do not consider the Apocrypha to be Scripture, but I think there are some of these things that it kind of brings to light. We mentioned John 10 before, and that idea of the good shepherd
Yes.
discourse, where Jesus is talking about being the good shepherd. All who came before me were thieves and robbers.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned the Maccabees. Then it's taking place on the Feast of Dedication. That's what John tells us is where that passage, when that takes place. Dedication is Hanukkah. That's when you're celebrating the Maccabean kings.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus comes and says, "I'm the good shepherd," right? I'm the. If you're celebrating Judas Maccabeus today, I'm the good shepherd. Shepherd, of course, standing for ruler, and so those are the kind of things that it gives us background to. I think helps us understand just a little bit more nuanced than we might notice otherwise, and gives us kind of a different understanding there. I was actually talking to one of our listeners. Go ahead. You're going to ask something.
No, go ahead.
I was talking to one of our listeners about this not too long ago, and he's a part of a church that uses the lectionary, and he was saying, that good shepherd comes around every year, and it's kind of like, oh, what a nice image of Jesus as this gentle shepherd, this mild shepherd. But again, in the context of Hanukkah and thinking of it in terms of the background of the Maccabean dynasty that was there, the Maccabean kingdom.
And that Hanukkah was a celebration of that conquering.
And then he says, all who came before me are thieves and robbers, but I am the good shepherd. And the good shepherd will lay down his life for the sheep. And so, basically saying I'm a different kind of king than you guys are looking for. This is a different kind of situation than what you're celebrating. We're not going to do a military kingdom. It's a different kind of kingdom that I'm coming to be king of.
Yeah, and it's radical in the sense of, yes, I'm going to die or I'm going to lay down my life for you, but also like he's denigrating in some ways these, well, I don't know if it's denigrating, but just he's making a statement about those who have been before and who they're kind of, they're celebrating the temple being cleansed again, but also Judas, the what these men have done. Right. And they would have been considered the shepherds of the people, like the leaders. Absolutely. And so he's saying something about himself and also saying something about them.
That's right.
And so
That's
it's
right. It would have been radical. You're right. I get what you're saying now.
Yes, there would have been a radical nature to it, and that not only am I different, but I'm way better than them, and that's. But you're here to celebrate those other guys at this point.
And again, can we understand? Can we understand that passage without that? Yeah, probably. But I do think it gives us, like this listener was saying, it gives a different kind of a thought between the gentle shepherd carrying, this picture we have of Jesus carrying the sheep on his back, which all that's true.
Right.
But when you think about shepherd as the word that's used in the book of Ezekiel for the kings and Isaiah for the kings, and then you have him, it's like the 4th of July, right?
Right.
And here I am saying, all those other presidents, who came before they were looking out for themselves, but I'm coming. And I always say thieves and robbers, it's about violence and it's about greed, right? It's about, and like you said, within a couple of generations, they're doing things for themselves. And, it's kind of a sad story, but within a few generations, it's hard to believe, but you have this Maccabean king who's crucifying hundreds of his own countrymen. Mm-hmm. Crucifying, which is considered, again, from the Old Testament, we know this, the Old Testament perspective, a cursed way to die.
Generations are a problem in the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, you start with someone that's, got a king that's good, and then and then he had sons, and they were evil.
Right.
Or
Samuel,
the priests,
Samuel, and you're right. It's not a bad.
Quit having children. I think I'm teasing. That's a joke.
So
but
speaking of righteousness and people dying, let's talk about the book of Tobit. How'd you like that transition?
That's an excellent transition, and I think everyone's going to enjoy it.
So what I said, in the narrative sections of the Apocrypha, we have these stories of what it's like to be a righteous Jewish person in the context of exile. So here's how Tobit starts. Tobit starts by him talking about how righteous he is. And he uses a couple of different examples of this. One of the ways that he shows he is righteous is that he gives proper burial to people who've been killed. So the Jews considered it to be a curse on the land if a dead person was left overnight. Again, we hear the same thing in John's version of Jesus' crucifixion. He's not his version, but he's the one who gives us the detail. They wanted to come and break the legs of the people on the cross so they could
get the bodies down.
Okay. So he actually gets in trouble for that. He gets put into prison for a while. And then when he gets back to his home, he's getting ready to celebrate one of the Jewish feasts. I can't remember what it is. I think it's the Feast of Pentecost is what they're getting ready to celebrate. Let me see if I can find this real quick. So this is basically he's saying, I was such a righteous guy. I was trying to follow the law. I was trying to do the right thing. Okay, that's all very good. And then, what was the feast? Pentecost. Yeah, it's chapter 2. You've got it there. Chapter 2, verse 1. Just read that. I know there's some names there.
Yeah. Then during the reign of Esarhaddon, I returned home, and my wife Anna and my son Tobias were restored to me. At our festival of Pentecost, which is the sacred festival of weeks, a good dinner was prepared for me, and I reclined to eat.
So he's getting ready to celebrate. He's been away because of his not being a righteous person. He's come back to celebrate this feast of Pentecost. What a great time. It's time for the family to get together and have this feast and all this kind of thing. What happens is this neighbor comes and says, hey, there's been somebody's murdered whose body's laying out here, one of our countrymen. And so Tobit, because he's such a righteous person, rushes off in order to bury the body before the next day. But here's the problem, and we've talked about this in a couple of different places. When you were getting ready to celebrate the festival, you had to do a ceremonial
cleansing
to cleanse yourself. And when you touch a dead body, you become unclean. Okay, so he's trying to do the right thing. Okay, this is what this book is. It's putting us into this quandary. He's trying to do the right thing, but he makes himself unclean in the process of burying this body. And so he's just come back because he was doing this kind of stuff before, what got him into trouble. He's just come back to his family, and now he comes back and he has to. He's so righteous. He's taking care of this, but now he can't go into the house because according to the law, he's unclean, and until he can go through the process of cleansing, which can't happen until the next day, he cannot enter in and have this feast with his family, even though he's just returned. So it's it's a pretty cool story, right, so far. And so what happens is that he does all this, and then I want you to read. He goes and he ends up sleeping outside. Okay, and go ahead, read from verse 7 down through verse 10.
Okay. When the sun had set, I went and dug a grave and buried him. And my neighbors laughed and said, is he still not afraid? He has already been hunted down to be put to death for doing this, and he ran away. Yet here he is again, burying the dead. That same night, I washed myself and went into my courtyard and slept by the wall of the courtyard.
Okay, so he's not sleeping inside because to go inside the house makes it unclean. So he's sleeping out. He's doing the right thing. According to the law, he's a righteous person. Okay.
And my face was uncovered because of the heat. I did not know that there were sparrows on the wall. Their fresh droppings fell into my eyes and produced white films. I went to physicians to be healed, but the more they treated me with ointments, the more my vision was obscured by the white films until I became completely blind. For 4 years, I remained unable to see. All my kindred were sorry for me, and Hyakar took care of me for 2 years before he went to Eliamis.
Okay, so how would you summarize what happened there? How would you summarize the action?
birds pooped in his eyes.
Birds pooped in his eyes and he went blind. As happens.
I mean, if that's not just like, oh, of course.
Now, this is theological, though. This is a really theological issue because here's the problem.
I mean, after one bird pooped in one eye, wouldn't you move? Like, kind of go, this isn't a good place to sleep. I mean,
look.
I mean, is it the same time? Does it run over?
I'd say it kind of hit him all at once. But here's
some big birds, bro.
So the bird poops in his eye and goes blind. When I tell people this story, that's exactly what you said is exactly the way I tell it. And everybody's like, that can't be right. But I mean, is that not how you say that?
I'm not making this. I mean, who would make up a story about a bird pooping in your eye?
But there's a reason for this. And here's what I want you to see. And we're going to get into the mindset here. We're going to get into the worldview of a first century Jew. Okay. So why is he in the courtyard?
Because he couldn't go in the house because of his righteousness.
Because he's doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's the quandary that we're left with. Here's the problem we're left with. He is struck blind for doing what the law has required of him. Okay, and for a Jewish person of the first century, this would have been a huge issue. In fact, we see it in Jesus' disciples.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember John chapter 9, how that story begins?
I do not.
John chapter 9, they're coming along, and there was a man who was born blind.
Yes.
And the disciples asked Jesus a question. And what's the question that they ask?
Who sinned, him or his parents?
Okay, now, do you see their worldview there?
Mm-hmm. That sin led to...
There's no question that his blindness is a result of sin. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing that Tobit is going to have to deal with, because the rest of the book, not the rest of the book, but a lot of the book of Tobit then is a lot like Job.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's basically coming to him and saying, look, what did you do that you're blind? You know, his wife comes to him. It's like, all these people are saying you had to do something wrong. And he's going, I was doing the right thing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the reader's left in this kind of conflict. What's the correct way to understand Tobit's story? And I would say it's the same for the disciples there. Their question, though, to Jesus isn't, well, did this blindness just happen or whatever? No, this blindness has to be the result of sin. That shows their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
The only question for them, though, is he was born blind. Okay, so could he have sinned somehow before?
They must have been his parents.
Or was it his parents? Yeah.
So there was a curse on them.
That's their theological question. Was there some kind of sin of his parents, or was it in some way? That was the issue. There was no question in their mind. So what does Jesus answer?
Neither
this man nor his parents sinned. Now, he wasn't saying that they are absolutely righteous, right?
Mm-hmm.
But basically he's saying you've misunderstood the nature of the affliction of blindness here.
Mm-hmm.
You misunderstood it. Instead, he says God's glory is going to be revealed in this case. Mm-hmm. And by the end of the chapter, you get to that thing we've talked about before, where basically he says, I came so the blind could see, because he's healed him.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about it when we talked about the pool of Siloam, too. He put mud on his eyes, sent him away to wash in Siloam, comes back seeing,
mm-hmm.
becomes a better witness to Jesus than those who saw Jesus.
Right.
Even though he'd never seen him.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't even recognize him, which is why I think Jesus healed him the way that he did. But then at the end of the chapter, Jesus says, I came so the blind would be, so the blind would be able to see and the seeing would be blind. And you might remember the religious leader said, oh, are you saying we're blind? Right.
Yes.
And so, and yeah, basically,
yeah,
I didn't say it, you did.
Yeah.
But that's the point. But do you see how the Tobit story kind of gives us that worldview? It gives us an insight into that idea. That was just a common thought. This isn't just the disciples talking,
mm-hmm.
Out of the corner of their mouth or whatever. This is something that people believed. And so there again, I think that understanding these stories helps get us into the worldview of a first century Jewish person. We've talked before about Pharisees. We've talked before about these different groups. And again, these writings, in addition, I'm going to mention the book of Josephus, which technically was written after the most of the New Testament would have been written. But again, Josephus talks about this period of time, and it helps us understand, again, the worldview of the first century. There are other writings that can help us too, but that's how I would say more or less that we can use these things. Does that leave you with any questions? Or
yeah, I think it's hard for me sometimes. I'm glad you're pointing this out. Like to see these connections sometimes, like where
okay.
it's the story is interesting, but for me
Right.
sometimes it's hard to make those connections between like, oh, see how it's. I'm trying to figure out how to describe it, like how to see
Sure.
myself in that, and like how that applies to the New Testament.
Well, I'm going to tell you this, and it's funny. I was just talking to a guy. There's a person I talk to on a regular basis that preaches, and we get into discussions of these from time to time. And this is one of my, and it might be worth talking about sometime in terms of when we're thinking about preparing Bible studies and that kind of thing. But I always say I try to put myself as much as I can into the worldview of a first century audience. Now, here's where it gets, this is even a little bit finer point.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're talking about the Gospels, we're talking about a first century Jewish mindset.
Mm-hmm.
The Gospels take place in Judea, Galilee. A few things happen in Samaria, and a few things happen in what we call the Transjordan, on the other side of the Jordan River. So as much as possible, you try to get yourself into the mindset of a first century Jewish person in that context. And so, part of this is, like I've talked about, the stone water jars.
Right.
It's just reading this kind of stuff and trying to put yourself the most you can into that mindset. I've talked before about, a pre-modern context, which for a lot of people means kind of talking about the supernatural elements. But for me, as much as anything, it means no technology. It means no electric lights, right? No electricity, no combustion engines. Trying to think, what would it have been like to be in that place where the primary mode of transportation would have been your feet, maybe a donkey or a horse. The way that agriculture was done would have been a different thing. Cleansing was a different thing. So as much as you can, putting yourself into that mindset, and that's a lot of when we're talking about the culture, that's what we mean. I think I've said to students for a long time. I think many times when we read Sermon on the Mount, we picture a bunch of 21st century, in plaid shirts, right? 21st century North American Christians standing around with their NIVs open.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the way it was. And so it requires a little bit of imagination, but as much as we can read these other things, it kind of puts us into that mindset. That's a lot of what you're doing in order to try to understand what's being said. Like I said, the story gets a little bit different when we're going into places like Thessalonica or Philippi. And that's where, again, you read a little bit about the background of Roman colonies, for example, in the case of Philippi, or you think about Ephesus and the role that it had within the world of Asia Minor, and Port City, and the religion of the Greeks and the philosophy of the Greeks.
Right. There's a lot going on there.
There's a lot going on. And so, again, you're trying to think, okay, what would it have been like? 1 Thessalonians 4, I can't believe I'm going here, but 1 Thessalonians 4 is one of those passages that there's a lot of debate and problem over. If we put ourselves into the position of people who had just accepted Jesus, within the past several months, and had never heard the name of Jesus a year ago, right?
Right.
That's who that letter's being written to. And too many times, again, we read it first as 21st century North Americans in our current context without thinking in those terms first. Now, I want to be careful. And in fact, we were talking about this earlier. When I start talking this way, I always get people saying, "Well, you're saying it doesn't have a message for us." I'm saying, no, absolutely. It's got a message. It's truth. But to understand that truth, we have to understand it first within its original context.
Right. Context. Yeah, we've had that conversation about verses and Old Testament, and kind of going, how do we understand what this is God? Because it was delivered to the Jews, but kind of going, it's saying something truthful about God, but it's about the context of what this message is delivered.
And then when we understand what it's saying, then we can make that application to our context, to our situation today.
Yeah, context. I mean, we keep harping on this, but contextual reading and understanding is so important to the message, because we have a tendency to insert ourselves, in everything. And
when we're, and like I've said before, we always make ourselves the hero of the story.
Yeah, we would never be the bad guy.
But then the context we're not only talking about the literary context, in other words, the text that surrounds the passage we're looking at, but also we're talking about the cultural context and the historical context and linguistic context. Those are the things I always keep coming back to. And that's what I mean. And again, I've said this before. I know it takes some work. I've done some of that work. I've done this reading, and for me, it's always come back to just make it come more alive. And the more we kind of think about these things, when we were talking about Daniel, I was thinking about this. We were talking about the way that you'd separate wheat and chaff. And understanding those practices just gives us another insight into the image that's being given to us there. If we don't think about these things, we kind of just go by them very quickly. I talk about all the time with place names and people names and that kind of stuff. We stop and think what group is being talked about. Get out a Bible atlas, a good Bible atlas, and look at these places and see what the significance is there. We could talk about some examples of that another time. But then culturally, just understanding the culture the best we can. I just think it opens up Scripture so much, and will give us just a greater appreciation and understanding of what God's saying to us. Again, I've said this a dozen times. He chose to reveal himself to us in these particular historical contexts. So it's up to us to make ourselves equal to the task of hearing this, I think. So
yeah. And, the name things, I was doing a study on Romans recently, and, someone said, look at Romans 16.
Yep.
And you look at there and you see the names, and some of them are Greek names, and some of them are Jewish names.
Yep.
And so you have a much clearer picture of who the rest of the book, who's being spoken to. It's this mixed group of people.
Mixed group.
Understanding the names.
Another little detail, since you brought up Romans 16, I just talked to somebody about this last week. There's two different groups there that Paul says, and these were my own family, my own relatives, and the only ones of my relatives who've accepted Jesus, who are Christians. Yeah. And so you get this image of his kind of, that he has been separated from a lot of his immediate family, because the word he uses is kind of for kinsman, a distant relative. And, gives an idea of kind of the loneliness of what it would have been like to have been Paul. Anyway.
Yeah, because he was a good Jew.
Yeah.
He was a Pharisee among Pharisees. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, they were probably proud of him. That's my boy, when he was going out to get the Christians. And all of a sudden it's, whoa, time out when he makes that change. So let me ask you this. So we know in the synagogues, they're reading the Jewish scriptures. Like they would have been part of the... So where were these books, let's say the Pseudepigrapha and the Apocrypha, were they read in synagogues? Like how were people exposed to this? Do we know?
I don't know too much about that. That's actually a really good question. I'll have to do some research on that. That's a question I haven't really thought about too much. I think... I'll tell you, I think they could have been. But then the other thing I think is, and I don't know that it's necessarily that some of these are being read, but the stories are being told, right?
Right.
They're being handed down and they're being told in this way. But yeah, it's a good question. I'll have to think about that.
I just wondered, if we see that First Enoch is referenced in Jude, like was it? How pervasive was it? Was it in the reading circles or the synagogues?
Here's a non-answer to the question, but
excellent. That's what I was looking for.
Well, at first I was thinking, they're Greek, not Hebrew, but then the Septuagint, so part of the thing that happened, we talked about the Babylonian exile, and when people were taken, part of the way Babylon kind of broke the different nations was they would take them away into exile and bring other people in. The Syrians were the same way, and so what we call the diaspora, in other words, the Jewish people began to be scattered throughout the entire...
Dispersed,
dispersed. Scattered is literally the word. And so, North Africa became a center of Judaism, Alexandria, for example. And one of the stories, this is actually a pseudepigrapha. Okay. I didn't plan to talk about this, but there's one of the pseudepigrapha that's called the Letter of Aristeas. And it's a story about how the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, came to be written. And it takes place in Alexandria, Egypt, the story. And basically the story is to show that it was when we talk about translation, it actually just reminds me that it was a group translation. Basically, there are these elders of Israel that were brought together, but now they didn't get together in committee. The story goes that they each spent exactly 40 days, if I remember the story correctly. There were 70. That's why we call it the Septuagint. 72, actually. I think there were 6 from each of the 12 tribes. But they each went into their cells separately and translated and lo and behold, each translation was exactly the same word for word.
Whoa.
Now,
right. Got it.
But what that story is telling is basically the reason that letter of Aristeas is written, I think, is to give validity to the translation. So, that would only be a divine act. And
right.
So basically the author is saying, well, we can trust this Greek translation. And what it shows us is that there were Jewish people, and later we find out other interested Gentiles in these things that could no longer read Hebrew. Right.
Gotcha.
And so the Greek translation is necessary because that was the language that they used.
Mm-hmm.
But they wanted it to be, a valid translation that could be trusted. And so that's why you get these elders of Israel. Part of the letter of Aristeas is worth reading too. It's kind of funny because a lot of it is this big feast that they have, and the king of Alexandria asks all of these different questions, and these elders of Israel take turns giving their answer, and it just shows their wisdom and what wise people they were. And so it's to back up, the story is to back that up. Well, what does that tell us? And here's the connection part you're talking about. Well, it tells us that there are these Jewish people who need this Greek translation in order to understand. And then you get people, the Septuagint is usually, not always, but usually what is used in the quotations in the New Testament of the Old Testament is usually the Septuagint. There are a few places where Paul, for example, seems to translate his own. And most famous is perhaps 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But you get what I'm saying is they use this Septuagint, this Greek translation of the Old Testament, when they quote the New Testament.
Interesting.
So yeah,
very cool.
All right.
So how would we go about finding this? So I for everyone, I bought the New Revised Standard Version, the New Oxford Annotated Apocrypha on eBay.
That's like the Apocrypha study Bible, I always say. I used to assign that in Intro to the Bible. I would always assign that text for my students. So you can find it there. You can find it online.
I don't think you can find it just on its own anymore.
Right. Yeah. I like that. I like that version, but or that edition, I should say, since I was talking about versions and editions.
Yeah.
The
Pseudepigrapha, where do we find that?
Pseudepigrapha, a lot of it you can find online. There's this 2-volume set edited by James H. Charlesworth that you can find that's called the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament if you want. So that's a pretty expensive book, but you can find a lot of the stuff online. Just be careful of the translations and don't read anything that people say about First Enoch, for example. There's all kinds of crazy stuff out there. And I didn't tell you this, but Enoch, the reason Enoch, in fact, we call this the Enochic literature. There's more than one book that's attributed to him. The reason he becomes such a big figure is, you might remember the book of Genesis, the story is told he's a seventh in generation from Adam, but then it says that he walked with the Lord and was no more. And so there's this kind of idea that means that he was translated into heaven, that he didn't die.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that necessarily is what it means, but anyway, that became kind of the tradition. And so he becomes this figure. When we talked about apocalyptic literature, like Ezekiel, book of Revelation, we often have these heavenly beings, like angels sometimes, or Jesus in the case of the book of Revelation, tells John some of these things. But we find these heavenly persons coming down in order to give special revelation to the people who were writing these books. And so Enoch becomes one of these figures because he was a human, but then he was translated into heaven. So he has special insight into the heavenly realms, right? Mm-hmm. And so he becomes, and that's why the book of First Enoch has a lot of this kind of hidden mysteries about him, the different things that are happening. And it's kind of it's got an apocalyptic section to it. You don't care about. We'll talk about the book of First Enoch another time. But it was edited. There's 5 different sections to it. Whatever. We'll talk about Enoch another day. But
so the moral of this episode is that the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha can give us a glimpse behind like worldview about what's going on.
Yeah.
The Bible as we have it now, that's probably sitting on your shelf for most people that are listening to it, is scripture,
right?
But this other material can help us get in the mindset and to understand what's going on there. And if you have a choice, or you only have an option, read the Bible. Don't read this other stuff. But that there's a lot that's happening in there, because I think that's always the question is like, what happened? What's going on? And I've asked you this question before, like, where did the Pharisees come from? Where did the Sadducees come from? And there's so much, there's political things happening, but there's spiritual things happening, and stories that are being told or wherever they're being told, because I stumped you on that one.
Right. That was good.
I don't know where they're being told.
I'll have to do some research. And I'll say this too, don't read the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha as though it is scripture. It's different. And like I said, there are going to be some people out there on weird websites about it, nearly everything, right?
Yes.
But there are going to be people out there who take these things more as, revealed by God, which I would not understand them to be, but they're more about what, the same way you could read, what's a good example? Lord of the Rings. When you read The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, Roman Catholic Christian living in England in the 40s, you get an idea from even that fictional world, something about what he's believing about the way the world works. And so it's the same kind of thing to get into the worldview, into their understanding. So
yeah, and kind of on that thought, and you've talked about this before, is that the Jews at the time did not put these stories, they were not considered canon or scripture for them during this time. And so the people that were living during this time where these stories were happening didn't include them as part of their scriptures, but they were an important part of their world and their culture at the time. And so again, it kind of helps reveal what's going on in there.
Right. I've said before, we basically adopted, and even for Jews of the first century had different canons, but we basically adopted the Pharisaic canon. I mean, that's the one we adopted, because the Sadducees only used the 5 books of Moses. So they would have considered anything after Deuteronomy to be not scripture. So we adopted the Pharisaic, which is what Jesus uses. He's the one who he makes reference to it. He quotes from it, quotes from the Psalms, quotes from Isaiah. So,
yep, absolutely. Cool. Well, this is a fun little interesting episode.
I hope so. Yeah, we try to do that. So we'll encourage people to read their Bibles and try to understand, put themselves into the world of the first century. And
yeah, and I like that the earliest manuscripts don't have this, with a woman caught in the act of adultery. How do you say it? The adulterous woman?
Yeah, woman caught in adultery. You can say that.
Yeah, and read Susanna. So we had the intertestamental conversation, and I went and bought Apocrypha, and I read Susanna, and I was like, that's really interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And some of that Apocrypha stuff, like you said, is very story narrative driven. And also, another moral of this episode is, don't sleep below a brick wall where birds might poop in your eyes.
Especially sparrows, apparently.
Sparrows, man. They're known eye poopers.
They're the worst. Sparrows, if you learn nothing else in this episode, sparrows are the worst.
You just look at them and go, those are going to make me blind, and just get away. So, all right. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
All right.
And remember, we're still working on our sign off, I guess. So
this is the Brian half of Ryan and Brian's podcast. Signing off.
Have a good one. Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Next week, Brian and I are taking a look at the book of Daniel. As Daniel contains prophecy, we take a look at historical events and how they align with what Daniel foretold. We hope you'll join us for that. Very interesting conversation. You can find show notes, links, and more at thebiblebistro.com, as well as sign up for our email newsletter to stay in touch, but also to get some exclusive content we have out there for you. We've put together a tutorial video on how to use the Blue Letter Bible. It's a free online resource to look at the Greek and Hebrew behind the English translations we use. Can really help you understand what's being said in those translations. So sign up for our email newsletter and you will get that tutorial video. You can find us and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at The Bible Bistro. And as always, you can subscribe to us on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Just search for Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. Thanks so much for listening. We will talk to you next Tuesday.